Oh, I have a video. Do you have sound?
We have sound? No, there's no sound. There should be no sound on there. At least not that I was aware of.
So, Tinakoto katoa. Today we have a special topic presented by Colin Meurk. Colin Meurk is many things, but mainly an ecologist. And today he will talk to us about stories of evolving landscapes told through tree leaves. Colin, the floor is yours.
Kia ora, thank you, Nada. Kia ora koutou. Well, if you read the abstract to this talk, you may have sort of seen it looking a little bit like a stream of consciousness. So I hope you won't be disappointed that the presentation will be a little bit like that as well. We'll see whether it makes any sense at the end. In fact, if I go down to the first slide here, a year ago I actually wrote a book chapter entitled Think Like a Matai. It was in a book edited, a Massey University Press book edited by Suzette Goldsmith, and this book was called Tree Sense. So in a sense, that's what the presentation today is all about, is making sense of trees, making sense of landscapes, making sense of trees in landscapes. And in a sense, it's a little bit of kind of the ecology and psychology of trees and people that work with trees or grow trees or design what trees are going to go in landscapes. And I suppose the metaphor of the matai, which of course is a very significant tree in the New Zealand environment, it's very sort of iconic in that regards. It's always appealed to me somehow. Maybe I identify with it in some respects, in that it starts off life as a pile of dead twigs, kind of looking like a little bit like this. Oh, I do have a pointer here. And eventually, in the fullness of time, it becomes a giant of the forest, and it can live for over 1,000 years. And as I say, sort of breathing slowly, kind of watching the world go by, taking in the planet, and so on. So it's a very important tree because it also, the female trees anyway, produce lovely big berries, which some of our large bush birds particularly depend upon. The kiruru, for example, has got a big enough gape in its bill to be able to swallow these large fruits and disperse them around. But they take their time, and in a sense, it's a little bit representative of the whole New Zealand ecosystem, which I'll come back to in a minute. If we sort of fast forward a little bit to the present time, you may recall that there is a large sculpture in the middle of Cathedral Square here in Christchurch, but it's a little known fact that it's actually made up of silhouettes of foliage and flowers of a forest buried under the city. And so in the last 1,000 years, the last few hundred years probably, the city has been very dynamic. Before it was a city, of course, with floods coming from the Waimakariri River, burying pre-existing vegetation, and in some cases forest, tall, mature forest. So all of this is a bit of a metaphor for slow journeys, and meditating on the multiple values that exist in ecosystems and landscapes, and through time. And of course, coming to the present, last few centuries in New Zealand, the cultural connections that get interwoven with those trees and plants. So after, when we look at a landscape, after the sort of broad landforms, the geomorphology, trees are generally the most powerful objects in that landscape. And they speak to history and to placemaking. And it's because of their size, obviously, their bulk, the fact that they dominate whole biomes, and that, you know, they're basically bigger than human beings. You can walk underneath trees and under forest, and you are to some extent awestruck by their size and bulk. And of course, they have a whole range of different forms, from very straight columnar forms to more spreading types. We'll look at the texture and colours and so on a little bit later on. They all have their distinctive histories. The matai tree, as I said, is one of these great southern Gondwana elements in New Zealand. But we have many trees imported from all over the planet. And they, in various ways, define the character of the place, the city, the countryside, and the wilderness. And so when we travel through the city, we have trees on the long streets, along rivers, and gardens, and they all are telling us something about their story, even if it's kind of quite subconsciously that we don't fully understand. But there are sort of subliminal messages going on there all the time. They provide inevitably a whole range of ecosystem services, and they represent, you know, some sort of interaction of power dynamics. You know, we can clear forests and trees, and for some people it gives them a sense of power and authority over the environment, and also we often develop fashions around trees. We become fixated on a particular form, shape, colour, and then they're all sort of all over the nurseries and available everywhere. Anyway, you can see already I'm sort of delving into a little bit of psychopolitics here, and inevitably, you know, trees are sending all of these messages subliminally, but we are interacting with those in a whole range of different ways. We are determining, given the dominance of humanity on the planet, you know, what trees will be in places. And so we have a role in influencing all of those messages clearly. And so what the motivations and what's going on in our aesthetics, etc., is going to be quite important in terms of what those messages are, and in turn how people interpret their history. So just to give a few specific examples, the power of trees, as I've sometimes called it, the Roman legions gained some of their power as they sort of invaded across Europe in the day, a couple of thousand years ago, by carrying long poles of poplar or other trees with them as they traversed across the countryside. And they could use these together with axes to cut them to the right lengths to cross rivers, and thereby not impede their progress as they're sort of invading across the countryside. Interestingly, that symbolism of those bunches of trees, which in Latin is fasces, was used as a symbol of fascism. It was implied, you know, the power associated with that bunch of branches together with the axe, you know, for fashioning them to shape. Of course, many of us are familiar from an English culture of the role of oak trees as being a symbol of power and strength. Interestingly, also a certain German leader was planning to put a Lombardy poplar avenues all leading to Berlin to exercise, a bit like all roads lead to Rome, I suppose, same kind of symbolism of strength and power. And we seem to have now a bit of a fashion about, you know, fastigiate oaks or fastigiate growth forms, very columnar. I'll maybe touch very briefly on that a little later. But of course, in New Zealand culture, we're also familiar with the importance of totara as a symbol of strength and power. You know, when a famous person, a powerful person dies, they often say a mighty tautara has fallen. Okay, so this will be my last reference to this, so you can relax after that a little bit. It's a little bit Freudian, perhaps, or maybe that's too male a perspective, I'm not sure. The sort of insidious sort of fastigiate growth form, but on the other hand, you can see it beautifully, more nicely kind of presented as the sheepscape here, which I took a picture of just down the road a little bit one evening. You know, the Lombardy poplar certainly is a very kind of compelling kind of form and shape, but perhaps more appropriately to New Zealand, you know, our mighty podocarps, which in the sense that you know, these big dominant trees in Europe are called noble trees. I believe we should be sort of focusing on the New Zealand noble trees, the podocarps, tautara, matai, kahikatea, rimu, and so on, and of course up north kauri trees. You know, these are the sort of symbols of our power and relate to our cultural, I believe. So, as I mentioned, the land forms and land shapes. Did I say lamb shapes? No, land shapes. One too many coffees this morning, perhaps. You know, do of course are the first arresting feature of our view of the landscape. And of course, importantly, you know, looking across the Canterbury Plains to the mountains in the distance, the mountains, of course, are composed of ancient rocks which go back to the Gondwana supercontinent. And so, you know, there's history represented in all of these different layers. The most recent ones, of course, are the Canterbury Plains, which are only, you know, maybe a few thousand years old, and the coastal environments. Anyway, this is all important in terms of, you know, how we fit plants to the landscape to reflect the underlying not only climate, but also the drainage and the soil fertility, and so on. It's important always to be aware of the particular special nature or conditions of the New Zealand situation. And it's sort of depicted in this maybe rather sad picture showing the decline of both forest over the last 1,000 years since humans arrived, and also the loss of wildlife associated with the introduction of huge numbers of both plants and animals from all over the world. And importantly, our plants and animals evolved in relative isolation from mammals. There were no native land mammals in New Zealand, but all of the continentally evolved species came with all of that kind of like very sort of in-your-face pressure from both predatory mammals on the one hand and browsing plant-eating mammals on the other. So these had an enormous impact on the strength and resilience and growth rates and reproducibility of our native flora that didn't have that kind of pressure on them. And importantly, one of the consequences of that is that a large proportion of introduced trees and shrubs produce dry seeds, like pine cones or acorns, and which are great for rodents or squirrels, but not very good for many of our native wildlife. On the other hand, the majority of our native plants and shrubs bear either berries like that, or nectar, like in the form of kowhai, which are very important to our honey-eating and berry-eating bush birds. So you can see a disjunction there between, you know, a landscape dominated by exotic trees versus one dominated by native trees. On top of that, of course, many of those introduced species have become incredibly invasive, and you know, there's like something like 2,500 native plant species in New Zealand, but about 30,000 exotic plant species in New Zealand, of which maybe a tenth have become naturalized or wild, and a large proportion of those have become invasive and Here's just one example or a couple of examples of wilding conifers which are taking off in the high country. Plants like ivy, which completely smother the understory. And the worst combination of introduced invasive species are those which are evergreen, like ivy and holly, that are shade tolerant, like ivy and holly, and which are bird dispersed. They have berries, like ivy and holly. So every time you sort of sing that Christmas carol about the holly and the ivy, just bear a thought about that. And of course, when these plants begin to dominate the landscape, we have a phenomenon called extinction of experience of those people living here. We live in a landscape dominated by the exotic species because they grow very fast and well. They're often our productive species because they've been imported for that reason. And so that's all we see. I'll show you some other examples of how we subtly kind of subjugate our native flora and contribute to that extinction of experience. And that has an important influence on our attitude to our native flora and fauna, to our conservation ethic, what we regard as being important to protect, what we're protective about, Well, here's an interesting case. This was actually a couple of years ago, 2016. I got this editorial from one of the journalists who contributed to the press. You might have heard of that newspaper. I'm sure you get all your information off social media these days, but never mind. There are written sort of physical presses that you can read as well. Anyway, this particular guy, Chris Trotter, who is generally a progressive thinker, he wrote this comment from Auckland, actually. Christchurch would be dreary without its exotic trees. And he wrote this in the middle of winter, actually, and I immediately went out and took a picture of the cherry blossoms along Harper Avenue in winter, looking very uncolourful, and I would have thought very dreary, actually. And I then went around to, I think, the University of Canterbury campus and saw these lovely examples of nice, rich, sort of olive green tōtara trees growing in the otherwise deciduous exotic background. Yes, the blossoms look lovely for a short period of time, and as I'll say, it's not about kind of replacing one completely with the other, but I'll come back to that point. So trees in the cultural landscape, what trees to plant where and when. We've talked about the various services provided by trees, from carbon through to amenity and everything in between. How we plant spatially to get the most benefit from these through the landscape. The first priority always is to protect those remnants of natural vegetation and ecosystems where we have them, and the importance of visibility, providing a lovely landscape architecture term of legibility. In other words, being able to read the stories in the landscape. And about the authenticity of that, leading to a sense of place identity, which is founded in our place rather than imported from somewhere else. And increasingly, there's got a lot of debate about, the loss of tree cover in our cities, the importance of that, of increasing that, again, not only for the aesthetic value, but it's well known to have calming effects on people, physiological benefits, on blood pressure, and all of those indicators of human health and well-being, and of course that cultural significance. Okay, here's just a few images illustrating some of these points. Up here we've got a streetscape from just down the road, actually, dominated by the lovely golden elm, various other exotic, largely deciduous trees, and of course that tropical influence, which we always sort of try to kind of emulate through the phoenix palm there in the background. And interestingly, even when we grow native trees, we often go for the golden forms. We like that sort of color, the golden tōtara there. But warning, the golden tōtara is actually a sterile sort of cultivar, and so does not contribute, as many people mistakenly believe, to wildlife value in the city. They don't produce any fruits, in other words, and they don't regenerate. We have what I sometimes have referred to as the green fluff effect. Here is down near Horswell, a lovely row of conventional oak trees, forming a lovely sort of neat, nice, regimented, ordered row. And stuck in right in the back there's some harakiki and a few toi and such like. What effect does that have on our attitude to our own native identity? Similarly, along Anzac Drive in eastern Christchurch, you have they planted in respect of the Anzac concept of Australia and New Zealand joining together and everything. Okay, they didn't just sort of put a cluster of gum trees from Australia, in one corner and another one down the other end and a lot of native trees in between, lovely sort of partnership. No, they planted gum trees right along the front row, which will grow bigger and stronger than the native trees stuck in the back row, and because I've been to an Anzac Drive in Australia, actually, I can tell you there were no New Zealand trees there. What's going on here? Okay, I want to quickly sort of refute the notion that I want to get out with my chainsaw and chop every oak tree down and every exotic tree. It's not about that. In fact, all of our ecosystems in the world are recombinant ecosystems. That is, they're mixtures of plants and from all over the world. But it's important within that our native species sort of shine through and are reflective of our own identity. So it's not about eliminating one layer of history for another, but it's about combining, blending, harmonizing, celebrating the richness. And I guess I saw quite an interesting example of that in Sydenham Park, shown here in its full beauty in the springtime, with the conventional, exotic, deciduous trees there in their sort of winter form, without any leaves. But here, with their lovely golden flowers, the kowhai tree, which will, of course, provide that important nectar source for native honey-eating birds. And these will grow up, taller. They won't grow as tall as the exotic ones, but, they'll be quite prominent as they get older. And this sort of maybe reflects another principle, and you may be familiar with in landscape architecture, is Joan Nassau's messy ecosystems, tidy frames. So you can still have tidiness and order and so on without subjugating, the local for the introduced. And it's pro-wildlife, as I've said. Okay. Right, here's another example of sort of recent plantings, things which are sort of more or less in tune with the local environment. So these are all around Lincoln here, actually. So down at Manaki Whenua there, you've got some lovely examples of kauri trees. They're not local, but they're from New Zealand. That's okay. There's a beech tree here. Well, beech doesn't naturally grow down here on the plains, but it's in the Canterbury environment. We've got a lovely fierce lancewood here, which is a little bit out of shape here, but nevertheless does represent one of those sort of architectural things which you can incorporate, and it's all a matter of at the right scale, the right amount, that it doesn't overshadow other important messages in the landscape. Well, that's my view. And also, can't see it too well here, we'll have a better one later, of Kānuka. I'll come back to that later. It's a very local Canterbury thing. So there is, of course, a whole movement to sort of rebalance what has happened in the Christchurch area. It was very much dominated by the English garden city image for the last 100 years or so. But there is both, as some of the pictures have shown, a number of native trees being incorporated into landscaping increasingly. But there's also natural regeneration happening because those trees now exist in the landscape. They're now sort of producing seedlings, and some very nice examples. This was in the red zone here lowland ribbonwood, suddenly springing up in great profusion. But even more exciting to me is that after about 20 years, slightly less, we've had tūtara seedlings. These are little tūtara seedlings here that have regenerated after plantings that were done in the year 2000, and they're now just beginning to produce seedlings in the last couple of years. And we're seeing this in a few scattered locations around the city because there weren't a lot of source plants in the city to do that because of what we've been planting for the last 100 years, as I said. Interestingly, even in a lawn, it's a bit of a microforest, this isn't it really, but as a meadow come up in a sort of wild lawn in the red zone, and native orchids have come up there as well. But also there's a huge interest and demand from the community to plant more natural habitat, and that's been going on quite abundantly in the last few decades, I suppose. And here's another example just down the road, actually, at Plant and Food. It was just planted a year ago, and a lane just next to the service station down here with a totally native corridor there. So there are changes. Next for you, just some interesting images of the particularly sort of architectural, as I see it anyway, rather appealing growth forms that exist in our native shrubs, the juvenile forms of some of our trees like the lancewood, that is especially represented there. Of course, they do grow up into more normal looking trees as they get older, and so they'll lose that very intriguing and distinctive growth form. We have a lot of divaricating shrubs, which, of course, as I'll emphasize, have got lots of difference of textures and shapes and colors and forms. And of course, when you have different lighting against them, they can seem very appealing. And, I can imagine how you and your creativity might sort of look at how these could look at different times of the day or different seasons of the year. As the light comes through them or is reflected from them. And, we've often sort of preferred exotic plants and trees because they're more colourful, they have golden leaves in the autumn. But, we do have more subtle colour in the native flora, particularly in the berries and sometimes in the twigs. And we do have some nice yellow flowers there sometimes. And we've got the golden kowhai, of course, and in particular, we have a lot of snowy things. I like to think of the kānuka as kind of like the Canterbury Christmas tree, because it flowers so beautifully and profusely around Christmas time, as does the narrow-leaved lacebark, the hauheri. But, okay, so it's white, but no, it's kind of like creamy white, and you can see more into it if you want to. So that to me it's a very Canterbury tree. It would have been dominant across much of the drier Canterbury plains. It's a natural successional species, after maybe older mature forest has been destroyed for one reason or another. It's very sort of drought tolerant, and it's just the right sort of scale for many urban environments. It doesn't get too big, but it can fit into an urban sort of setting quite well, I believe. And we've got a few nicely coloured tree brooms as well. So that's something to keep an eye on, including a Canterbury one that's endemic to this area. We have a lot of trees which belong to families which back in their homeland, if you like, in Europe or North America, wherever, are largely herbaceous. For example, this is a native member of the violet family, which is actually a small tree, mahui. We also, the cabbage tree, the tikōka, is in fact, broadly speaking, in the lily family. And of course, kowhai is commonly a is in the legume family, which of course commonly elsewhere in the world is herbaceous, like clovers and lotus and so on. So, we have these other unusual aspects to our flora, which, is something worth kind of like bringing out and revealing. And the honey producing harakeke is a big lily too. It's a big sort of, can grow quite a couple of meters tall. Plant signatures, you'll be familiar with these sort of ideas, I guess. But, there's wonderful sort of, again, the architectural forms of these plants, which can make interesting kind of garden situations, which are sort of abstractions of natural communities. Just quickly looking at the different elements of a landscape pattern. We have the large catchments and watersheds, and within those we have patches of different kinds of vegetation that kind of stand out. And so forest is obviously one of those as a kind of patch, and those which we need to protect. Some of our most vulnerable wildlife need special protection, so we need to create sanctuaries around some of those patches by fencing them off from introduced predators. These can be connected through the landscape through corridors of various kinds. We'll have a look at that in a minute, or stepping stones, because many wildlife can fly or move across the airscape. And so they're kind of like virtual corridors. And then there's all the sort of matrix in between, which is sort of the lower growing or different scaled species that occur in between. So the dispersal patterns, are reflected by the optimal spatial configuration, like we can see here. So it's a bit of a complicated diagram. I'll skip through it fairly quickly. So here's large patches, which might be predator-proofed to provide sort of sanctuaries. There are smaller patches in between, which provide stepping stones, and there are kind of groves in every neighbourhood or every little playground, say, in every street, which kind of just remind me that, yes, we are in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and there are corridors that kind of can link these of various kinds. But the important thing about this diagram is that in the matrix in between, we've got people living, working, playing, who are interacting with these patches of habitat, and there was an English kind of planning kind of model which said that there should be a reserve that people can walk to within 5 minutes walk of every house in the town. So that might be some sort of an ideal, especially when we're looking at densifying our urban environments. We need to have compensatory green spaces with trees in them, to enable that kind of shinrin-yoku, that Japanese concept of forest bathing, which provides all of that important human well-being, just being able to walk in the woods every now and again. This is an example of those sanctuary patches, Riccarton Bush here, Mongotautari and Waikato, Zealandia and Wellington, and so on. So here's a sort of predator-proof fence which protects these rare wildlife and enables them to kind of then step outside their kind of safety and interact then with the wider matrix and the community outside. This hopefully is familiar to most of you. Riccarton Bush here. I don't know how the time is going.
Another 5 to 10 minutes.
5 to 10, okay, right. All right. So Riccarton Bush, of course, is one of those classic patches right in the heart of Christchurch City, an ancient forest here, floodplain forest. And importantly, the message around here is knowing these habitats, because it's floodplain, knowing what are the right plants to plant in the right place, but also in the right time or right sequence. So, that's an underlying message here. Patches, of course, can be very tiny and enclosed. They can be in a courtyard, like you've got just outside here. This one's down the road at Manaki Whenua, and can provide little sort of oases of calm. Patches can also be like a traffic island here, which could provide a little microhabitat for lizards or insects. And then these are connected by the corridors that I've mentioned. There's some very nice examples around that are now kind of starting to grow up quite well. This is QE2 Drive here with a whole mixed forest corridor. This is just down the road at Ladbrokes. This one here is actually a Muhlenbecher complexa hedge, and it's kind of gradually over time displaced what was formerly a kind of conventional gorse hedge here at Ladbrokes. And importantly, it's providing food sources for native butterflies, for native lizards, and for native smaller birds, bush birds. So it has fruits and berries and also foliage that is eaten by butterflies, New Zealand butterflies. Just some more examples. So another kind of corridor is streets, very important, again, because they're so visible. Visibility is the key to conservation culture. I've already talked about the kānuka, but there's tautara here, tikoka, kowhai, marble leaf. There's a whole lot of things. We might have to get away from this notion of just having, you know, those very fastigiate forms, as I mentioned, and go a little bit more messy and a little bit, there's a whole range of species that could be used here, which I won't dwell on. And the other kind of corridor, of course, are our river corridors, and there's a huge variety of habitat, you know, closed up along a very sort of short gradient from aquatic to quite dry up on the top within just a few meters. And each of these locations has its own distinctive tree flora suitable for it. Up on the top terrace here, tautara, kowhai, kānuka. On the sort of slope, on the foot slopes here, matai and hinau. This is in the Canterbury environment. On the floodplain, it could be kakatea, pokaka, tikoka. Lower banks here with pukio and harakeke. So, you know, they all have their own little signature and can be used, therefore, to sort of sell a message about, you know, the range of environments and habitats and species associated with it. Okay, moving along, I think we've already seen enough of that. There is at one point here about the distinction between order, control, and simplicity versus wild, textures, functional, and diverse. I mean, I did sort of clean up myself a little bit today, but I'm usually looking pretty more like the wild kind of, you know, hopefully functional form a lot of the time. And again, we've seen images of this already. Textures, light, reflections are referred to the role of light. And then there's the matrix between these patches. You know, you've got, you know, you can have native lawns, swales and drains and cracks in the footpaths. You know, that's where, you know, often people are interacting through walking, sitting, etc. Foundational principles. Again, very quickly, a lot of words, but it's all about joining up the whenua, the ecology, the tikanga, the colonial worlds, and looking at how they kind of all fit in together, kind of reflecting on Mataranga Māori, and, you know, maybe somewhat convergent concepts of ecology, etc. Yeah, so this last few slides are about, you know, the cultural interaction between that. And, you know, I often sort of actually draw on sort of European sort of history here. You know, I'm very taken by the kind of walkways through the countryside, the natural countryside of hedgerows and even meadows and rock walls with native plants and things, which we didn't sort of replicate in the kind of colonization of New Zealand. We kind of imported all of their stuff and put it here. We don't have a New Zealand equivalent of that yet, but, you know, we're working on it. So some of these are in Britain, you know, taverns and things, but also Spreewald in this case, the a biosphere reserve site in Germany, the classic English countryside, and just a list of species that could be incorporated within a sort of a farmed environment on those sort of classic elements of countryside. You can see a paper that I wrote with Simon Swaffield a few years ago, which sort of touches on that. And of course, right into the heart of the city, incorporating and what's an otherwise, you know, often we've had a very polarized view about nature belonging up on the mountains and national parks somewhere versus culture being down here, and that's always been interpreted historically here as exotic culture or English culture. But we should be looking at how to incorporate our own native bush cities right in the heart of the city, and reflecting on that chalice that reflects the underlying native forest. There's a bush city outside Te Papa in museum and Wellington waterfront. So, that idea is sort of modelled on this. And actually, I feel really bad is that this was actually drawn up by one of your former associates, and I've forgotten her name, and I'd like to get it so I can put it on that diagram, showing what that kind of, bush city kind of oasis might look like there. And of course, incorporating Māori kind of symbolism to reflect, the wider cultural connections there. So, landscape which is richer, more functional, with nature as well as productivity in it. A high country version of that, showing a conventional utilitarian high country landscape that we've sort of created over the last century, but how it could incorporate much greater diversity, and particularly in relation to trees, retaining those remnant native vegetation, even where you've got exotic plantations, incorporating a stronger border of native species, and eventually having more native production plants, using those noble trees as future sort of cultural harvest. And we're getting there. Other symbolism, of course, the role of tree ferns here, and the kind of the unfurling of the young shoots of the silver fern here, reflected in our symbolism on our aircraft, the koru, unfolding of new life. So there's all sorts of ways that we are beginning to weave and join up all of these different elements, and I find that quite exciting actually. Every time I see bracken fern growing along a railway line, I think of the fires of Tamatea in Canterbury, when the early Polynesian fires resulted in loss of forest and vegetation, and then in the ashes of that forest came up bracken fern and grass and so on. And so, there's a story there to be told as well. The Tikoka here at Burnside High School, which is regarded as one of the sort of early ancient track markers for ancient pathways across the plains to collect pounamu on the other side of the island. Revegetation work being done on a marae site, kaitiakitanga represented there, wonderful Māori carvings here at the Pegasus Town entrance, and so on. But alongside, the garden city ideas, and importantly now the national park city concept, which in fact there was a big reference to this on the other medium you may not know much about, is New Zealand Radio New Zealand, where Sir Peter Gluckman was talking about a new proposal for Auckland City, and picking up on this national park city, which I've been promoting for Christchurch for quite a number of years now. There's the summary slide. Look at that. We've come to the end. If you can read all of that, many ecological solutions to biodiversity and other emergencies, cultural landscapes for a multi-dimensional inclusive city. Wow, gee, that would be great, wouldn't it? So I guess one of my key messages, and particularly in relation to trees and the role of trees here, is sharing power. We need a biodiversity partnership in those recombinant ecosystems. In other words, equal visibility of our noble trees, of our big trees alongside, not sort of stuck in the background or out there, out of sight, out of mind. Legibility of those landscapes, which you will know about, having the right plant, the right place, the right time, that ensures an authenticity of our landscapes, weaving the treaty principles through those landscapes, winning hearts and minds, achieving ecological literacy, that is understanding the functioning and the history, is critical to our sense of place. Nassau's tidy frames I referred to, dealing with that, some people's desire for control and order and regimentation. Yep, that's part of our human spectrum, which we have to accommodate somewhere. But it often is a minority, I actually think. shifting all of these things into the mainstream and reversing extinction of experience and what is sometimes called nature deficit disorder, which is also being talked about. Embracing connectivity, legibility, eco-literacy, and kindness. Maybe, National Park City is one of the means of achieving that. And I just mentioned finally the Global City Nature Challenge coming up at the end of April. So this is on iNaturalist, the website for recording natural history observations. If you're not familiar with it, you might look that up, iNaturalist.nz. Okay, kia ora. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.